Welcome to Daily Brief YouTube channel. Conflicts continue in the Middle East under the shadow of the occupation in Eastern Europe. While Russia is trying to invade Ukraine, it also cares not to lose its influence in Syria. After Israel's great support to Ukraine, Putin's uneasiness about Syria may have increased even more. Countries such as Iran, Israel, Turkey and the USA are also struggling for power in Syria in addition to Russia. Although these powers agree on limited issues in limited times, they all have different goals and interests. While the USA states that it is fighting against terrorism that threatens the world, Russia is trying to secure the future of its military bases in Syria and to achieve more. While emphasizing that Turkey is fighting because it does not want a terrorist state on its borders, Iran implements the policy of containing Israel. Israel also states that it is carrying out operations to prevent Iran from deploying militants that will threaten it. These operations caused Russia, which held the air dominance in Syria, and Israel to come face to face several times. Despite the complex relationships of so many powers, the region has been quiet for a while. As of today, Israel has broken its long-standing silence. Israel, which remained silent with the start of the Russian occupation against the increasing Iranian-backed militant movements in Syria and did not carry out any attack, launched an attack on the Syrian capital Damascus today. We will soon examine the details of this important move by Israel. Tensions between Israel and Syria have been going on for the last 6 months. As a result of the increasing activities of the Iranian-backed militants in Syria and Lebanon, especially in the southern regions of Syria, Israel increased its airstrikes against the region. Naftali Bennett, who met with Russian President Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin and agreed that the Israeli attacks should not be prevented by Russia. The tension between Russia and Israel increased again as Israel attacked the Iranian-backed militants in the port of Latakia. As a result of this attack, Russia, which prioritized the security of the Tartus port, reactivated its air defense systems and placed Russian warplanes on Syria's southern border. Russian warplanes will patrol the region with warplanes belonging to the Syrian regime forces. Russian Su-34 and Su-35 warplanes make it difficult for Israel to dominate the air in the region. However, given the increasing shipment of militants, it was a question of how long Israel would pause the attacks. 2 people were killed in an Israeli airstrike on Damascus today. Syrian state media reported that the explosions reverberated over the city skyline and the country's air defense systems were mobilized in response to Israeli aggression. It is known that the air defense systems used by Syria, especially the S-200 and S-300 purchased from Russia, are Russian-made. However, Russian air defense systems are not always successful in preventing attacks. 2 people were killed in an Israeli attack near Damascus on Monday night, according to Syrian state media. According to the state television report, planes belonging to the Israeli Air Force departed from the direction of Beirut at 5 o'clock and Syria's air defense systems were activated in response. It was also reported that the hit targets were damaged and the echoes of explosions were heard in the skies of the capital. This is the first attack attributed to Israel in Syria since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. A few days after the invasion, the Russian embassy in Israel announced that military coordination with Israel in Syria would continue, and senior Russian military officials would discuss this on a daily basis. This mechanism has proven effective and will continue to work, the Russian embassy said. The announcement came after Russia expressed dissatisfaction with Israel's statements about the war in Ukraine and Israel's ambassador to Russia, Alex Ben-Zvi, was summoned for a statement. While Russia is trying to appear to be an ally with Israel in Syria, the fact that Israel completely prevents its attacks is an issue that can increase the tension in the region at any moment. However, it is an obvious fact that Israel also protects its relations with Russia in the region. Israel is cautious not to undermine this coordination in its statements about the war in Ukraine. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has called for an end to the war on several occasions, but has so far avoided publicly condemning the invasion or mentioning Russia or Putin in his statements. In turn, Foreign Minister Yair Lapid openly condemned the Russian invasion. Meanwhile, Israel supported the UN General Assembly's decision to condemn the Russian invasion, after it assured last week that Russia would not harm security coordination between countries in Syria, according to a political source. Bennett met with Russian President Vladimir Putin over the weekend and spoke with him again on the phone yesterday. The last attack attributed to Israel in Syria was hours before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In Syria, it was reported that Israel attacked targets in the Kenitra region with ground-launched missiles. A source from the Syrian army told the Sana news agency that the missile attack was carried out close to midnight and there were no casualties. Israel is a strong ally of the United States, and its leaders have a good relationship with Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's Jewish president. But Israel also doesn't want to provoke Russia. On the day Russia invaded Ukraine, Israel's Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, did not mention Russia once. Mr. Bennett said he prayed for peace, called for dialogue and promised support for Ukrainian citizens. But he did not hint at Moscow's involvement, much less condemn it, and it was left, as pre-planned, to Mr. Bennett's foreign minister, Yair Lapid, to criticize Moscow in a separate statement that day. The pair's cautious double act embodied the bind in which the war in Ukraine has placed Israel. Israel is a key partner of the United States, and many Israelis appreciate long-standing cultural connections with Ukraine, which, for several months in 2019, was the only country other than their own with both a Jewish president, Volodymyr Zelensky, and a Jewish prime minister. But Russia is a critical actor in the Middle East, particularly in Syria, Israel's northeastern neighbor and enemy, and the Israeli government believes it cannot risk losing Moscow's favor. For much of the past decade, the Israeli Air Force has struck Iranian, Syrian and Lebanese military targets in Syria without interference, trying to stem the flow of arms that Iran sends to its proxies in both Syria and Lebanon and to limit a military buildup on its northern border. Israel also wants to leave itself enough room to act as a go-between in the conflict. After Ukrainian requests, Mr. Bennett has offered at least twice to mediate between Russia and Ukraine, most recently on Sunday, when Mr. Bennett rushed abruptly from a cabinet meeting to speak with President Vladimir V. Putin of Russia for 40 minutes. And Israeli officials, including Mr. Bennett, shuttled between their Russian, Ukrainian and American counterparts on Sunday afternoon, two senior Israeli officials said, a mediation that may have contributed to Ukraine's decision to meet with Russian officials on the Belarusian-Ukrainian border. Israel, which often asks that its allies support it unconditionally, finds itself in the uncomfortable position of appearing to refuse to publicly criticize Russia, even when other countries with seemingly more at stake have condemned Mr. Putin's war. It is a delicate situation for Israel, said Ehud Olmert, a former Israeli prime minister who dealt often with Mr. Putin during his time in office. On the one hand, Israel is an ally of the United States and a part of the West, and there can be no doubt about it, Mr. Olmert said in a phone interview. On the other hand, the Russians are present in Syria, we have delicate military and security problems in Syria, and that requires a certain freedom for the Israeli military to act in Syria. Israel also wants to avoid taking any action that might stir anti-Semitism against the hundreds of thousands of Jews in both Ukraine and Russia. And Israeli officials must simultaneously consider the responses of Israel's large Russian-speaking population, who form about 12% of its electorate. Roughly 1.2 million Russian speakers have arrived in Israel from the former Soviet Union over the past 3 decades, about a third of them from Russia and about the same from Ukraine, according to government data. Some of the latter are even back in Ukraine to defend their original homeland. Yes, I love Israel, but I have 2 countries and I need to defend both of them, said Mikhailo, 25, an Israeli-Ukrainian digital marketer currently fighting in Kyiv, Ukraine's capital, who asked to be identified only by his first name for security reasons. Here is a war, he said in a phone interview on Sunday afternoon. I need to do my job. Israel's primary concern is to maintain its ability to act in Syria with near impunity and without Russian interference. But Russia also maintains a significant presence in Syria, and Israel needs Moscow's goodwill to continue to operate there with ease. Israeli officials currently notify Russian counterparts about impending strikes, and vice versa, using a special encrypted communication line between the Israeli Air Force's subterranean bunker, situated under a military base in Tel Aviv, and the Khmeimim air base in western Syria, a senior Israeli defense official said. Any change to that relationship might complicate both the Israeli and Russian strategies in Syria. In September 2018, Syrian anti-aircraft missiles firing at Israeli planes hit a Russian aircraft that was passing through the area by coincidence. It crashed and all 15 Russian soldiers on board were killed. Russian planes have been more active around Syria's borders in recent weeks, both on the western border with Israel and in eastern Syria where American planes frequently operate, the senior Israeli defense official said. The uptick may have been a show of force intended to send a signal about the growing Ukraine crisis, the official added.